due to scheduling reasons. So we will be making this recording available after the session airs today. Thank you for being here with us today for Introduction to the Communication Matrix Assessment Tool, Shared Science and Community of Practice. We are incredibly grateful for our funder, the WITH Foundation. They have made this project possible with their generous support. A couple of things as we get going. Just a brief reminder to close, if you were like me with a million tabs and windows open, go ahead and close any extra applications that are going to drain any of your bandwidth or resources. We do plan to have a couple of opportunities for discussion. So after Deirdre's presentation, we'll have a period for questions and answers. We will also be presenting a very brief case study for discussion as a group. So we do ask during the presentation, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Julie and I will be monitoring that today. Hopefully you've seen, we do have a survey that was sent out to you in the emails ahead of time. We're going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat again. This survey is being sent out. We're just collecting feedback regarding the efficacy of this training and any impact that it might have on professional practice. All of the results are void of any identifying information, and there is no requirement to participate in this survey as part of this program. It's not attached to CEUs or anything like that. We do appreciate the feedback. On that note, I'm going to stop my share and Deirdre is going to bring hers up quickly. And I will introduce to you Deirdre Galvin-McLaughlin. She's a clinical instructor and speech language pathologist at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. She has expertise in AAC with clinical interests in supporting people who experience motor or sensory access challenges, traditional forms of technology. She works clinically with children with developmental disabilities and neurodegenerative conditions, and also adults with developmental disabilities who have complex access challenges. She does work as a research associate in the Renew Lab under the direction of Melanie Fried-Oken, developing a brain-computer interface for AAC, serves on the Go Baby Go Oregon Committee, and is the editor-in-chief of Speak Up, the AAC blog hosted by the United States Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, as well as a member of the board of directors for the Communication Matrix Foundation. That is a mouthful, Deirdre. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this series. I was talking with Carolyn before and the organizers, and I just think it's such a great opportunity to focus on adults who rely on AAC. So as Carolyn so awesomely introduced me, we're going to talk about the communication matrix today and sort of the suite of tools that have been developed to go alongside that, so that if you were to have a client with emerging communication and needed some direction or some support, you would have a whole host of resources to go to that are hosted through the communication matrix. Oh, okay. And so Carolyn already introduced me. We can skip some of this, but I also will say that my relationship to the matrix began when I worked on as a research associate on their grant. And my role was to do a lot of back-end data aggregation, processing, and management for the shared science reports, which is a feature we'll go over today. So it really helped me learn the ins and outs of the matrix and also appreciate a lot of the other tooling that comes along with the matrix that I hadn't realized when I was just working as a clinician and using it as an assessment. So I hope to share that with you today as well. So disclosures, I'm receiving an honorarium. My partner and I just moved to Massachusetts. So actually I'm in between my Oregon gig and hopefully a new Massachusetts one. And my non-financial disclosure is that I'm a member of the Communication Matrix Committee. So learning objectives. We today, hopefully you'll take these with you. So I hope everyone will be able to identify 2 features of the communication matrix assessment that would address the needs of an emerging communicator. I hope that you'll learn to utilize the results of a matrix assessment for treatment planning and progress monitoring. And I hope that you can differentiate between 2 other resources that are housed under the matrix site, which is called Shared Science and Community of Practice. So we're going to start with the basics and sort of a high level overview. And then as we keep going throughout the next hour, we're just going to dive into more and more details so that you can really get a sense of how to use the matrix. So what is the communication matrix and assessment tool? So it's an evidence-based expressive communication assessment tool for people who experience severe communication challenges. And I bolded expressive communication because when I've trained graduate students or clinical fellows in trying to do a hospital-based speech and language assessment, it's almost like I have to always point out like, oh, we need some other receptive language measure to supplement this because this is really going to focus in on just expressive communication. So that's something to start out with as we talk about what the matrix does and focuses on. It evaluates all different types of communication. So it includes symbolic forms of really any kind. So spoken words, sign language, braille, picture symbols, tangible object symbols, but also pre-symbolic communication. So gestures, iconic or descriptive, body movements, sound, eye gaze, and facial expressions. It also covers 7 levels of development in the earliest stages of symbolic development so that you can get a range of skills if you have an emerging communicator. So how does it work? Right now, it's an online assessment. It's written in plain language and designed to be completed by either a professional like an SLP teacher or other therapist, a parent, or really anyone else. And it gives examples for each specific skill. So that also makes it friendly to people who might not be a speech and language pathologist. And it has videos of children demonstrating that skill to give people ideas. There's also, as you go through the assessment, guiding questions and tooling built in to help with scoring or how to consider it if it were a communication device. So what do you get when you finish this sort of long questionnaire? You get this infographic that summarizes the result. We call it the communication matrix. And it shows sort of the ratings that you've completed for emerging, mastered, or not used skills. Those are the cells that are in the middle. It shows the reasons to communicate, which are on the bottom. So it sort of organizes the cells by one category. And then it shows the 7 levels of symbolic types the person is using. And so this infographic is really nice because it gives you a snapshot of how that person's communicating and why. And it's helpful for showing parents when you're talking about guiding treatment approaches or the results of an assessment for a particular person. And so how do I access it now? I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So if people are familiar with the matrix from when it was first started, it was paper-based. And then in 2003, there was a major grant that helped transition it to a web-based platform. So now when you go to the Matrix website, if you create an account, it looks pretty much just like this picture below. You'll have your profile, and then there'll be a tab for the assessment and then a tab for the community features. So like I said, you would create an account, you can save results and update it within 30 days. That's how you would be able to access it to use with patients. If you don't want to create an account, but still want to try it, oh, whoops, sorry. that's my next one. I was going to say, if you don't want to make an account, but you still want to try it, you can use the try it tool on the main screen, because it is hard to create accounts to get access to every website if you don't know if it's going to be a good fit for your patient population. And then recently, the Matrix transitioned to being a cost-based system. But each individual user who is a professional get 5 assessments for free. And that means you can save 5 assessments. So if you didn't want to save the assessments, and after you completed your report and printed out all the results and you deleted it, you could continue to add 5 more users. The $2 fee is when you exceed those $5 assessments. So each matrix after that is $2. Or if you anticipate that your center would need a lot of access to the assessment, you can have a paid group. It's $150 a year. It gives you 30 saved assessments, and you can split that among multiple different providers and purchase more assessments as you need them. So now we'll go over the research basis of like, well, how did they come up with these levels and these pragmatic areas to generate the matrix? So it was born out of 2 major pieces of work. One is from Elizabeth and Barnes and colleagues, who had this pragmatic approach, which considered what the person achieves by communicating using many different behaviors, rather than just looking at speech or other symbolic forms of communication. And then it also came from Warner and Kaplan's work, which was the emergence of symbolic communication is a developmental process that's the natural outgrowth of early relationships between mothers, infants, and the objects or events in their environment. So it considers, again, pre-symbolic skills and not just speech or other symbolic forms that are more abstract. It was developed using those principles and those theoretical background. And then there was extensive hands-on clinical research involving individuals with complex communication needs, their caretakers, teachers, and speech and language pathologists. So this is like a high-level structure organization for the reasons for communication. So there are 4 major categories that the matrix organizes reasons into: refuse, obtain, social, and information. And under each of those categories, there are 24 more specific messages for each reason, so that you can look at how that person is communicating for really specific purposes. And then that's usually like the bottom part of the matrix. Then there are the levels of symbolic messages, and we'll go through the levels because I think a lot of people will sometimes get confused about certain levels and what exactly they mean. I would say, like, when I was answering the helpline, that was the most often question I got. So I think it's important to go through so that you can understand kind of where different people would fall on the matrix. So the first level is pre-intentional behavior. That's behavior that's not under the individual's own control, but it reflects their general state. So comfortable, uncomfortable, hungry, or sleepy. This is more of a reflexive behavior. So like when you think about in typical development, in young infants under the age of 3 months, they're not really crying to communicate something to you. They're crying because their body is telling them they're hungry, or their body is telling them they're uncomfortable. They might be making cooing noises or other happy noises because their body is comfortable. So if you think about it from that perspective, it's behavior that is developing, the child or individual is developing control over, but it's not one that's directed at another person for communication. So the next level is intentional behavior. It's behavior under the individual's control, but it's not yet used to communicate intentionally. So individuals at this stage do not realize that they can use their own behaviors to control another person's behavior. So in typically developing children, this is usually between 3 and 8 months. And you'll see like a really great example is if you had like a 6-month-old infant in typical development who is reaching for a toy that they wanted that was just in their line of sight. It would tell their partner, oh, well, this child wants to play with this toy, but the child isn't doing it to tell them that. The child's doing it to obtain that. So that's how I like to think of intentional behavior. It's I'm doing something to get something, but I'm not doing something to communicate it with someone else. The next level is unconventional communication. This is when intentional communication starts, meaning that people are using pre-symbolic behaviors to intentionally communicate something to someone else. And these behaviors are pre-symbolic because they don't involve a symbol. They're also unconventional because they're not socially acceptable for us to use as we grow older. So, a really common example of an unconventional communication, if something was out of reach and you had a child who was like on their tiptoes grabbing for it, that is not a symbolic form of communication, but it's indicating to another person, like they're like, I really want help to get this down. And the next step after that is conventional communication, which are pre-symbolic behaviors used to intentionally to communicate. They're pre-symbolic because they don't involve a symbol, but they're conventional because they're socially acceptable to use and accompany with language as we mature. And they might be unique to a culture or situation where they're used. And examples of this include like pointing at something, nodding or shaking your head, waving or hugging. These are all non-spoken forms of communication that we use long after we develop speech or another symbolic form of communication. The 5th level is concrete symbols. These are symbols that physically resemble what they represent. This is usually between 12 and 24 months of age. And for some children, they might not even have this as a separate stage. It was added because there are people who have this transitional phase in between level 4 and level 6, where they are using something like a shoe, like holding up a shoe to their mom to say, I want to go outside, or bringing their mom an empty bowl saying, I want to eat. And so it's the actual concrete object that goes with that activity. So that's why it falls under this level. But it's kind of this in-between step between using pre-symbolic communication and using abstract symbols that don't represent what the referent is that goes with it. And so level 6 is abstract symbols. Examples of these are speech, manual signs, brailled or printed words, 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional symbols. They're abstract because they're not physically similar to what they represent. And at this level, they're used only one at a time. And then the final level is language. This is when symbols, either concrete or abstract, are combined into 2 to 3 symbol combinations according to grammatical rules. The individual understands the meaning of the symbol. Combinations may differ depending upon how the symbols are ordered. So it's not just that they're hitting a bunch of symbols in a row, like, cupcake, cookie, and generating combinations. It's more like want cupcake or go cookie to get someone to go and get them a cookie. So now we're going to dive more into the assessment now that we know how the skills are organized, and talk about the target use population. So the matrix can be used with children and adults with severe expressive communication challenge. It's best to use it with people who show emerging use of a variety of symbolic forms, which means, like, to avoid a ceiling effect, people who may demonstrate many single words for many purposes or are producing two-word utterances will likely have mastered all the skills on the matrix. So you're not going to really see where to go next because they're going to have a fully completed matrix and a really high score. And it might be best to use another assessment than the matrix for people who are starting to show single words or context dependent use of an AAC device. I'm going to just show, as I explain the assessment tool, a case study example so that you can get an idea of how you do decision making as you go through. And this is one of my patients who I am calling Lily for this presentation. She was a very social and bright 24-year-old woman with CP and a vision impairment. Loved Simon and Garfunkel, Adele, and carpool karaoke. She did not have a speech generating device or AAC system when I met her. They had trialed them extensively in the past, and they didn't really find a good access method given her vision. But Lily was using a power chair with a joystick to expertly drive around. And if you know about how hard it is to drive a power chair with a joystick, and Lily could do like 16-point turns, I knew she was really capable and really smart and able to learn. And so I was really surprised that that she had such limited expressive use of communication and how reliant she was on her partners to ask her yes and no questioning at this age, because she just had such excellent skills, in my opinion. This is an example of her communication. So she used one spoken word, mom, which she used to get her mom's attention. She did a sign approximation where she would do sort of putting her hand on her chest for yes. She did iconic gestures like shaking her head for no, waving hi and bye. And she did a lot of body movements. She would just drive out of the room if she didn't like something. She'd rock back and forth in her manual chair when she was frustrated or excited. She'd reach for and grab things to request. And so the question is Lily a good candidate for the communication matrix? And I would say yes. You know, Lily demonstrates a severe expressive communication challenge. She uses a variety of non-spoken strategies to communicate with partners, and she's not yet putting two symbols together. And for that matter, she doesn't use a lot of symbolic forms expressively. So there's a section before you get to the assessment online, and I like to just make people aware of it. It's the demographic information. And you might wonder, like, why do I need to put all of this information before I get to the assessment? And what that does, it helps us store the information in our database and then create shared science reports to share information on communications for people with rare conditions. All the information that we collect is de-identified. So we also do not recommend putting any personally identifiable information, like if naming the matrix client by the person's name. But it helps us generate these reports and give back to the community, because if you are a therapist who might be seeing someone with a really rare condition and wondering, well, how do other people with this condition communicate? It can be really hard to find information. And so this is just my plug of, like, yes, it is another thing to do, but you will be giving back to the community. And I find the shared science reports to be really helpful. So just so you know, there's like 10 little questions right before you start the assessment. There are 3 entry points. So there are 3 entry points because they're meant to reduce the number of items that you have to complete on the assessment if a person uses symbolic communication. So the first entry point is we call it entry point A. And the description of that is, my child doesn't seem to have real control over his body yet. And if you responded to yes to that, you would go to that first level all the way at the beginning of the matrix for pre-intentional behavior, because the person isn't necessarily volitionally moving their body to either do something or communicate something. Entry point B is, she doesn't come to let me know what she wants, but if it's easy for me to figure out because she tries to do things for herself. So that entry point, if you said yes to it, this describes my person, it would take you to intentional behavior, because this person is not communicating what they want, but they're doing actions that can be interpreted by another person as asking for something or not liking something. And then the final entry point is, the individual clearly tries to communicate their needs to me through gesture, sound, or language. And so if you have a symbolic communicator, you would just check surpassed at these first two entry points so that you don't have to complete all the questions or skills in those two entry points. You can, of course, do that, but if you're trying to kind of like reduce your time on the assessment, you know the person has at least one symbol or uses their body intentionally to communicate something to someone else, you just skip to part C. So what entry point is right for Lily given her communication skills? The answer is C. She surpassed A and B, and Lily's a symbolic communicator and uses conventional communication strategies. So this would be the correct entry point if I wanted to skip through the first two sections. After you pick an entry point, it will take you to questions that are organized by communication purpose. So each purpose has a yes and no question. Like these examples below, you can see C1, refuses or rejects something. Does the individual intentionally show you that she or he doesn't want a certain thing or activity? And you would just check yes or no, and it would expand to ask about how that person shows you that they don't want a certain thing or a certain activity. Likewise, with the makes choices question, does this individual intentionally make a choice between two or more items that you offer at the same time? You would check yes or no, do they do that? And then it would expand out to ask questions about how they do that. And the thing that I think the Matrix has done a really good job with is have videos and examples to show you what that could mean. Because I know most speech and language pathologists will know what these purposes are, but if you were having a parent or a caregiver or another therapist and they were wondering like, well, what does obtains more of something rather than more of an action mean? And they could get a sense from those examples. So this is just kind of what the skill ratings look like. So each purpose expands the items about all the possible ways you could communicate that specific message. So you rate each item as either not used, emerging, or mastered. And like I mentioned, there are examples and videos and scoring tips built into the online tool in case you need a little bit of help when you go through it the first time. So this is like how you would interpret a completed matrix. So just to reorient us to what the matrix looks like and what information it's showing you, on the left side here, you see the levels from level 1, pre-intentional behavior, to level 7, language. On the bottom, you see the 4 major reasons to communicate: refuse, obtain, social, and information. In the center are all of the individual reasons for communication for each level. Those were the 24 reasons that I showed you earlier. And then the scale of interpretation up here tells you whether that there is a skill used for that purpose. So not used, if it is emerging, if it's mastered, or if it's surpassed. So you can interpret the results in several different ways. A really common one that people use is they describe the overall picture of the matrix, and they might say something like, well, what is the primary level this person is using to communicate? And so for Lily, like I would say her primary level is unconventional communication. She has some mastered and emerging skills in level 4 and level 6, but for the most part, when I think about how she communicates most of her needs and most of her messages, it's through unconventional communication on level 3. Then I would make another thing that people commonly do is they talk about emerging levels. So Lily's emerging levels are conventional communication and abstract symbols. And then another way people talk about or describe the matrix in an assessment report is organizing communication by reasons to communicate, sort of that bottom section. And you can do it either both ways or either way. And I will go into examples of why one might be better than the other, depending on what your profile looks like. But for Lily, like she is using these communication needs for a lot of different purposes. And I think that's important. Lily was super socially motivated. She was using every skill she possibly could to communicate that message. I'm showing you another person to show a contrast of Lily's profile. This was another patient I had who was a teenager. He had epilepsy. He also had CP and a vision impairment like Lily, but he also had autism. And he would say pizza or nuggets indiscriminately to mean eat. And he primarily used symbolic communication for the purposes of obtaining. So when you look at his matrix, you can see that like most of his symbolic skills are under this obtain. So for his report, instead of focusing on a primary and emerging level, I might focus on how he's communicating or how he's communicating each purpose and where his symbolic communication is focused on just obtain and isn't in these refuse or social or information categories. I'll mention some other handy tools because a lot of people don't know about them. So this is a screenshot of what your screen will look like at the end when you've completed a matrix. If you click this link, view score, it will show you a raw score out of the total number and a percentage. And this can be helpful if you're trying to demonstrate changes over time, because sometimes the score is more sensitive than the actual picture of the matrix, and that might matter for things like insurance or IEP or whatever progress you have to demonstrate through your intervention. The other thing that you can get is a skills list, and you can print it out. And this can be really handy if you're trying to onboard a new team and they're trying to figure out like, well, how does this person communicate and what skills do they use to do that? It also can be helpful to attach into someone's file if they're going to be transferring to another person, or even just for like information that they have going over, and to talk about counting new skills over time. You also, if you, let me just scroll back for 1 second. If you tap a level in the main page, it will zoom into the percentage of skills out of the total number of skills to do this specific purpose at a specific level. And this can be helpful if you have like an emerging level to show like, oh, okay, even though this whole cell was orange on the big picture of the matrix, really they're doing 67% of the skills that they could be doing for Obtain. And so it can give you a little bit of more information, a little bit more of a nuanced look if you are trying to talk about such things in your assessment or trying to write goals for treatment planning. And then finally, like another one that's really helpful is if you click an individual cell in the matrix, you can see the skills that the person uses. And so this person uses, like Lily used, a spoken word for request attention. And you also can type notes and update them afterwards. So because this is Lily's only spoken word, I might type a note that says mom, so that I know kind of like if she were to get other spoken words, or if we were to increase other symbolic forms, like we would know what method she's using for each of those things. So, for Lily, I sort of touched on this. For writing up her assessment report, I would probably organize my findings by primary level and then emerging level, because, like I said earlier, she has skills across all of the purposes, and really, like, our goals were going to be more focused on expanding the amount of symbolic communication she could use independently without relying on a partner to prompt her with a yes and no question. Connor, I would organize by purposes, because all of his symbolic forms were focused on one major purpose. And I knew that, like, in order to get more robust communication and move away from some physical communication, we might really want to focus on trying to expand the purposes he's using for symbolic communication. Another feature that's optional is custom reports. Some people really like them. It's tooling that the Matrix offers to generate a communication evaluation for each patient. It will give you like a PDF at the end. You can purchase them by credit. It includes like a summary of current functioning, which you can write, summary of progress, and then it has some suggested goals that you can check or uncheck. I would say the primary audience that has been using custom reports are people who are writing IEP reports, like an assessment for an IEP, but you could use it depending on your setting. And you could just check it out and see if there's a workflow that might work for your setting that kind of mirrors it, which is what I've done at the hospitals that I've worked at. Okay, so intervention planning and progress monitoring using the communication matrix. So I'm going to use Lily and Connor as examples of goals that I did based on their assessment results. So with Lily, her goal was to increase access to symbolic messages for a variety of purposes. Because what was happening is Lily was using everything she could to communicate, but she just was limited with her motor and visual access to communicate other symbolic forms for complex ideas. And then, I found, given, you can see that Lily has a spread across all 4 different purposes. Knowing that, I also knew that I needed to embed these symbolic messages in a highly motivating social context, because honestly, if you didn't, Lily would just take her wheelchair and drive right out of the room. So what we ended up doing was working on accessing some symbolic messages to call her group home manager and even say like funny things like, I love you more than I love Deirdre. And she just thought that was hysterical. And it was so motivating for her to work on these access skills that were really, really hard for her. So, and then with Connor, again, because his communication is so focused on one pragmatic purpose, I would probably try to expand the specificity of the message because, like I said, he was using nuggets, pizza, crackers to just mean eat. You could hand him anything and he would eat it, even if it wasn't nuggets or pizza or crackers. And then I would probably try to expand purposes for communication, likely to expand symbolic communication to the refuse section, because what Connor was really relying on to refuse things was self-injury or injurious behavior directed at another person, which is a pre-symbolic communication behavior, to let people know that he didn't want to do what they were asking him to do. But at the same time, like for his own safety and for their safety, there would be a huge impact if we expand it to that area. So that's probably where I would go with Connor. And then just a note on progress monitoring. I kind of touched on this before. Insurance or other agencies love to see functional improvement on an assessment measure, like the communication matrix. I can't tell you the number of insurance forms I've had to complete where, if you do a standardized test with a person who is not kind of in the normative sample or is not going to score well on that test for a myriad of reasons, because they have a severe communication challenge, you end up writing, standard score of 50 on that assessment. And then if you did that assessment in 6 months or a year, you would also get a standard score of 50. You're not going to see improvement on a standardized test, but you will likely see improvement on this functional measure, either in the score or in the mastery levels of the matrix, depending on how quickly that person makes progress over time. And like I said earlier, a score and percentage might be more subject to change over time because it's based on each individual skill. Whereas like the big picture of the matrix will kind of collapse everything into those cells. And sometimes it doesn't give you like the level of detail or specificity that you might need. And you could consider and just try out doing a matrix in the first session and at discharge to demonstrate progress over time, and to demonstrate to insurance or whatever regulatory body you would need to, the need for ongoing services. And I think this is really major in this population because I've had a lot of patients I've worked with who have been discharged by their outpatient provider because they had plateaued on all the metrics that they were giving them. And it wasn't necessarily that the patient had plateaued in skills. They were still gaining skills, but it's hard to measure that. And so using something like the matrix can help you measure that and justify a need for services and support with a population who is really capable of making progress and really needs the support. Okay, so before we hand it over for questions, I'm just going to quickly go over some related tools. And they are the shared science reports and community of practice. So I mentioned this like earlier, kind of touched on it, but shared science on the matrix are reports that contain aggregated matrix results for low incidence populations. So this is an example of a shared science report for a really rare condition like Rett syndrome. You can see that the website will generate a map. It will show you what states the reports are coming from. So you can see, oh, does the person I work with that has Rett syndrome like compare geographically to where these results are coming from. It has a breakdown of gender, age, and functional rating levels. And then it gives you a big picture of like the average matrix results for a large number of people. And this one looks like there's 203 people, which Rett syndrome has an incidence rate of about 1 in 10,000. So that is a large sample for a really rare condition. And there are other conditions that are in there. And our hope, and one of the goals of the Communication Matrix Foundation, is to continue to offer tooling and support to share the information that just gets collected when people do this assessment report. And recently I was working on aggregating some data for a chapter that we're writing on individuals who are deaf and blind. And it was just shocking even to me, and I feel like I know this, but that we had data from 100 different countries, that with people who spoke 95 different primary languages. And so there's some really like rich and robust information that the Matrix has, because it's been used for decades, and it's a nice source of information to give back to the community, so that if you're practicing with maybe the one person with Rett syndrome you're going to practice with for your entire career, you have access to information on a large sample of the communication skills for that syndrome. And then there's a community of practice tool, which is a user forum where you can ask questions and share resources. So you can see a screenshot on the left-hand side where someone is asking, I'm new to the communication matrix. I am trying to figure out how to write an appropriate and functional goal for this particular client. And usually one of the communication matrix employees will respond to that question or provide resources, or sometimes other people will too. People will also just share free trainings or share resources on the community of practice, which is really awesome. There's also this other feature called collections, which are collections of blog posts by AAC specialists. I've written some in the past, but there's a variety of ones out there. So if you are looking for something specific, you likely could find it there. And it's another place besides SIG 12, or and also it's a free place where you can ask these questions and get support if you need it. So I am about done, and I'm wondering if now is a good time for questions.
Absolutely. I would love to take questions for Deirdre, anything on our presentation. Feel free to jump in and unmute for this portion with any questions you might have. Deirdre, I'd like to kick it off. Actually, I have a question. I love the shared science tool. I use it in team-based meetings. I use it with families. We use it with our students here as well. You mentioned it's collecting information or aggregate data on low incidence populations. So my question is there any designs on expanding those populations to individuals with diagnoses like Down syndrome or autism?
There are some, so I should say that's our major plug. We do have, I believe we have some shared science reports on those larger incidence populations as well. So I think there is, our goal is to try to share as much information as possible. And, the beauty of doing those larger ones too, is there's like very large samples of those individuals in the database. Like I would say 20 to 30,000 unique profiles. So it would give some really rich and robust information for those larger incidence ones. But I think given in the past, the grant we had written was focused on low incidence for that shared science feature. But in the future, I think there would be releasing of both.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have a question about accessing the community of practice, excuse me. So could you go over how people can access this?
Yeah, so you can access the community of practice if you make an account. And you don't have to, so the only charges associated with the account are when you have 5 assessments saved and you want to do a new assessment, there aren't any charges associated with these other toolings like shared science or community of practice. So if you had an account, you would probably be able to see them. They also, like, for collections I've written, I have linked them to recommendations, and they're accessible to people without an account too if you go through Google. But I think from the main page, if you go to the Communication Matrix website, the easiest way to get into community practice or shared science is to have an account.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions for Deirdre regarding her presentation?
I have a question. I have sometimes get stuck and find that parents and other caregivers get stuck on those binary choice questions when you are sort of forced to choose yes or no, and the answer is really sometimes. So what I've done in the past, and my question is this the correct thing to do? If it is sometimes, we choose yes. Is that the correct way to approach that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, it's all how there's really no wrong way, I think, to use the matrix because it is criterion referenced. It's not standardized. So I think as long as you represent the way that you used it in your write-up of your assessment, then anything that you approach it is valid. So I'll start with that. But I would agree with you. I think if they sometimes did it, I would click yes, because they are communicating that message some of the time. And if it were more of an emerging skill, I would just use a rating of checking emerging. So I think that that is what I would do in that case. It's sort of low threshold yes for those purposes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions regarding the presentation before we move to the case study? Oh, we've got someone's opened up a whole box of worms over here. We have a question about if scores in standardized IQ assessments are wrongly remaining the same, why should we continue to use it, and what is a better way forward?
Sorry. Oh, I see. If scores on a standardized like wrongly remain the same. I think, oops, sorry, I think that comes from more of a, I don't know, I could be opening a can of worms by responding this way, but I think that that comes from a more traditional approach to like speech and language pathology for people who, especially for people who have severe disabilities. I think I would argue a lot of the standardized IQ assessments are not valid, but they are, unfortunately, because it comes from this traditional approach, a lot of people are required to do them, at least for eligibility. But I think there's no reason for, I shouldn't say this, but there's no reason if you meet eligibility and you're trying to demonstrate progress, I think there's no reason for you to repeatedly do it over and over again, because that's not going to demonstrate progress. And you might get more robust information or more robust growth if you do a functional measure like the communication matrix. And also you might get a more fair and accessible and inclusive result by using something like the matrix. But yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people wonder, and I wondered too after I've been practicing for going on 6 years, and right after I finished grad school and I went into the world, I started working like pretty exclusively with this population. I was like, why did I learn all these standardized tests? Like, why didn't anyone teach me these functional things? Because I think that is really, that assessment skill set is really needed. And should be focused on more in graduate school training. So I agree with you, Bob. Yeah.
I will say in settings we've worked, that's why we use this tool, the communication matrix, frequently to augment those standardized reports for that reason. And then in the summary of results, we would often put in a disclaimer citing the perceived shortcomings of the standardized tool, perhaps the modalities that are acceptable in that standardized administration. And then in that explanation, go on to say that in this assessment tool, because it allows for use of multiple modalities, it creates this different picture. And then that's the images do a nice job actually of showing those changes over time as well. So that combination of standardized and more subjective measures work really nicely, I think, in those situations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, it's always a good point. And you'll have, I've even had with funding reports, people will say, where are the standardized cognitive testing, which at least in the state I was working in isn't legal. And there are really nice resources online that explain why standardized testing isn't great for everyone to show skills. And so if you ever have that, and I would say they're available on most of the speech generating device companies' websites as templates. So if you ever are in that situation, I would encourage you to look at those resources and also, either explain the shortcomings of it, but if you can't do the testing, also explain like what the rationale was for choosing this, because oftentimes insurance then will have met a criteria as well.
Hi, Deirdre. I have a question about the languages that the matrix is available in. I saw that you all have multiple languages that's available for assessments. Can you comment a little bit about, I guess, is it basically the same questions that are asked in each of those languages, or do you have some specific questions that are asked maybe for the population that's more Spanish speaking or Russian speaking and things like that may tie in more culturally to what they would look at in their pragmatic and social development and things like that?
Yes, this is a really great question. I know for the languages, so there's kind of two different sets of translations or interpretations that are available for the matrix. One is integrated into the site. So you can click like choose your language up at the top, and you can choose Spanish, or you can choose Russian, or you can choose, I'm trying to think of some of the other words, and it will flip the site into that language, and it will ask those questions. I do not know actually if if the questions are culturally responsive, like where the context makes sense for that culture or language, but I know that for the ones online where the site can flip like that, they were interpreted by a professional interpretation service, and at least for Spanish, they've been highly used by speech and language pathologists who also speak Spanish and are a part of that community. There's also this secondary set of translations that are available in other languages where people just volunteered their time to translate a PDF into that language. Those ones haven't been vetted in the same way. And that's because it was just kind of like people were just being really generous and reached out and said, I would love to make this more accessible in my country or in my community. And I have this skill set. And so they interpreted it. We've recently been going, we've been trying to formalize a process for that, because we know that like high quality interpretation and translations are needed, but they're also really time consuming and costly. So we're trying to figure out a process where we can have more of that in the future. But it is a really excellent question about the cultural responsiveness. I am honestly not sure if the questions were changed to be more culturally responsive, but I know the interpretations, at least of the website offerings, are professionally interpreted?
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
All right, in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the case study portion. I think Deirdre just made our contact information available as well. So if there's follow-up questions and you don't see the answers available on the website, please feel free to reach out and we will make sure that we get your questions answered. All right. You see my slides again? Thank you. So moving forward, following the ECHO model, every session we're going to introduce a case study. In the future, if you have an interest, please feel free to submit them. You can submit them to myself directly via email, or we're going to be sending out newsletters after the session, and we'll include a link where you can enter it online for future sessions. For this week, we have an anonymous submission by a newer clinician. So they have about 2 years experience in the field, but it'll be their first year working in a high school or a transitional setting. The prior experience is with elementary school age children. So the assessments that they were using previously were very heavily focused on language, articulation, and some pragmatic components as related to academic coursework though. And in discussion with the high school team, the expectations are that assessments and recommendations will now be addressing those transitional needs. So looking at kind of post-secondary options. Some examples of IEP goals that would have been used previously were very focused on specific sounds or specific language concepts structured around the academic environment. And assessment procedures that this individual is familiar with were largely standardized assessments. So that question was not a plant, but it's a problem we're all dealing with, as well as classroom observation and then some input from parents and classroom teachers. The transition team, as it was explained, is charged with making recommendations related to opportunities and supports after high school, whether those be additional education or work opportunities or day program type settings. And the clinician does not feel that the types of standardized protocols and classroom-based observations that they have experience with are going to give the information that the team is expecting in a transitional meeting. So as an example of the population that they will be working with, one of the teenagers on the caseload is a high school freshman. So in this case, about 15, with diagnoses of autism, apraxia, and a mixed receptive expressive language disorder. Primarily, communication has been occurring via PECS and a modified signed exact English approach. And while verbal speech is intelligible, it's very prompt dependent. So examples were given of kind of one-to-one aids in school and classroom teachers giving supports for communication to complete activities. They are aware that PECS was implemented in elementary school, but it's unclear what phase the student was in or if that protocol was followed. And the team reports that PECS are primarily used for choice making and new explain activities during transitional periods during the day. The signs that are used are very idiosyncratic due to the apraxia, so not necessarily the right height or following the exact movements that would be expected of a traditional sign. This therapist knows that the student in question can use a tablet and computer for things like watching YouTube, but is not clear if AAC devices or high-tech systems are ever trialed. They know that the student walks and sits independently. And while there are some sensory needs, particularly around loud sounds, they don't typically impact communication by all team reports. So the primary questions that are being posed today, in the hopes that we as a group can kind of discuss them, are what types of assessment tools are people using for transition planning? And for someone who's used to observations in classrooms for assessing educational performance, how can you approach assessing someone who is in transition, particularly in a setting where you have a very tight schedule? And so any language around communicating to your school team, how to get permission or the support to be able to be on site. And I'm going to throw the first question to Deirdre. In a situation like this, Deirdre, would the communication matrix be an appropriate tool for someone who's looking at kind of long-term transition planning?
I think so. And one thing I didn't mention that I intended to in the presentation was that you have some flexibility of how you complete the assessment. So you can complete it and edit it in 30 days. So if you have limited time where you're like popping into a classroom or a setting for like 10 or 15 minutes and you get like only so much information, you can go back later and supplement it with like teacher report or your own observation. So I think that's another thing to consider, that if you were in this setting, you can use it pretty flexibly to gather that information. I also think, again, it gives you that like wonderful snapshot of like how this person's communicating. And if we're thinking about transition and trying to explain that to all these other people that will come onto the person's team and who it's helpful to have these skill lists and images to describe kind of how and why they're communicating.
Perfect, thank you. Anybody else have some assessment tools that they've used for planning for this type of population, looking at this age group or planning for large scale changes? I'd say one of the things as school I used to work at, one of the things that we did when we had limitations in scheduling, we also created a lot of observational tools for the supportive team members to use and report back. So if there were limitations in the SLP team being on site, it's not a perfect solution, but creating kind of a structured, almost environmental inventory type approach, filming if your state and district allow that, on site and is appropriate to the environment, and that tape can be viewed after the fact. But getting that input from other team members, depending on the communication needs of the adolescent or adult in question, you know, some of the discussions that we had, for example, on some of those binary choices. So really making sure that the person feels supported in, these are the things that we're looking for, these are the types of responses we're interested to see. If the target is, are they moving between, in this example, we know that the person has multiple modalities. So if the question is, what modality are they using most often in a given setting, structuring those observation documents in a way that really makes it easy for the note taker to kind of chart that becomes very helpful.
Related to that recommendation, our team, and we have permission to do this, but we use Qualtrics, which is a survey database collection platform, and we create rating scales and binary choice questions and text entry options so that teachers who are with our students in the community are able to enter data on the go on whatever device they have, and it goes right into a database, so there's no risk of papers getting wet or crumbled or lost or anything like that, and it seems to work pretty well for us.
I love that. I've never heard of Qualtrics being used that way. Out of curiosity, Kathleen, are you in a setting where all of the team members have ready access to tablets or portable options to complete that type of tool?
Yes, I work through a privately funded program, and we all have access to iPhones.
The other plug that I will give for if you're going to use the matrix for this situation is that you can use it on mobile devices. So like if I've been at someone's house, I'll just like take out my phone or my iPad and just complete it as we're going. And if someone had a profile, like if you were going to do like a really concerted effort where the teacher had an assessment profile and you had an assessment profile, you could assign a matrix to the teacher and you could share those across groups. And then you could also get a matrix completed by maybe you and also the teacher and compare them. or you, the teacher, and the parent. So there's lots of ways to use it, in addition to other great assessments that are out there as well.
I will say on transition teams that I've worked with in the past, the other thing we've done is if the goal is, for example, an employment setting, having a representative from something like a vocational rehab on the team, talking about what those requirements are from their perspective and keeping that focus on that end goal. So, for example, I've had VR reps who've stated that they need to be able to communicate spontaneously with customers on an open floor in, say, a big box store in order to be eligible for that placement. And so having that knowledge, it really gears that assessment towards those environmental kind of observations and potentially helps with that team-based support to allow that to be facilitated. I think the other consideration I would throw out to the team as well, we don't have all the information in this case study, but where there was a question around whether or not high-tech systems have ever been trialed, if there was an interest in pursuing that, making sure that funding is also a discussion as part of that transition, as part of the school team, and if there is an external or outpatient team involved, making sure that communication is happening so that those steps can be considered and put in place as part of that evaluation.
I have a question for you, Deirdre, related to this case study. I'm wondering if you can comment on how the communication matrix might be useful in capturing the way that individuals are using their different communication modes and strategies across contexts. So, you know, we understand that we may be requesting using one approach in one environment and maybe a different set of approaches in another environment, for example. And would that be captured like in the notes section, or is that formally captured somewhere else in the matrix so that we can demonstrate to job training personnel or other, you know, other folks who are going to be communication partners that there's a range of abilities for our clients? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's not a perfect fit, because I think there isn't like a settings checklist or whatever, or level of support checklist either. You know, if you're doing it in one setting because you have, I don't know, the right things in place in that setting and not in another setting because you don't have those things in place in that setting. So the question makes total sense to me. I think some of the purposes are fairly specific and some of them are broad, like, so you're not going to capture it necessarily on those like 24 items per level. So I do think likely your best way of capturing that would be in notes if you were trying to think about that. And if you're taking data across different locations or different contexts, you could always consider doing matrices across different ones, and so that you get a whole picture. But yeah, if people do it lots of different ways, they'll have different people complete it. They'll have have one main one that's like an aggregate of all of the settings. But you always could have just a disclaimer of like, in these contexts where it's really noisy and sensory overload, this person is maybe not going to make a social bid. So I think that's fair to kind of write in a narrative too.
Thank you. I asked the question to sort of highlight the tool's utility, because I think that your response really highlights the ways in which we might show the range of abilities for our clients across communication partners and communication contexts, and maybe having one, as you said, maybe it's a lot of, might be a bit of work, but having one profile for one environment and another profile for another can really document clearly to the communication partners and potentially even funders, you know, of services, that there are different needs to be met in different environments. So thank you for that answer. We have a comment coming in the chat, so maybe I'll just read it out loud for those of you who can't access it. One of our participants, Jess, says she's having some spotty service, but she says, with the importance of observing the community but balancing a tight schedule, we bill in significant monthly billable consultation time for our transition-aged students, which makes accompanying them more realistic. So time can be used for a weekly session in the community, as well as a billable consultation to lessen impacts on productivity. I think probably, Jess, all of us want to know where you work, because that sounds like a wonderful, a wonderful bit of flexibility you have there, and really important as our clients are facing these transition points in their lives.
Those that do have that option, I think that's a great way to do it. And I like that she had said it can also be used as part of the weekly session in the community. So it's information gathering for the purpose of an assessment and for that transition plan, but it can also be addressing current goals. So it's kind of due diligence there. So Jess is acknowledging that she's very lucky. I think most of us would agree. And that her students participate in regular community and transition activities as part of their programming. And so they are, meaning the staff are encouraged to attend. So that is very fortunate. I think sharing that information about kind of the relevance that long-term plan does become very important, and the earlier in the planning process. So since it's the beginning of the school year for many of us, talking with the team about that now is probably going to have a greater likelihood of success as planning out for the year and what that might look like. Does anyone else have any thoughts on tools, assessment tools outside of traditional standardized protocols and or methods of juggling the schedule and validating that need to kind of higher ups? Right. Well, in that case, we do have a couple of reminders. We do have next week, we do have this is one of 14 sessions. So they're all going to be led by different subject matter experts and on different topics. So if you haven't, please take a look at the total series in Eventbrite to see what other topics might be of interest to you or other members of your team. Next week, we will have ease of access for augmentative and alternative communication being presented by Jennifer Stilianos, who is an occupational therapist and assistive technology professional. If you have a case study that you would like to have presented or that you could present to the group, please go ahead and reach out. We will be including that case study kind of form in the follow-up email that you'll be receiving after today's session. You will also be receiving the CEU participant form after the session. For those of you that are planning to attend multiple sessions in this series, you will only need to complete the form once, not 14 times. And you will be receiving CEUs only for the sessions that you do actually attend live. So our intention is to make these recordings available to you. And we've had a few people in the community reach out already to ask for that access. So those will be available, just not for CEUs. Only those who are here today will be eligible for that. And because it is a series, all that documentation gets submitted to ASHA at the end of the series, which means December. So for those of you who are planning to get your CEUs in by a certain date, please bear that in mind. We want to thank everyone who came today, and thank you for those who participate in any discussion. If you think of any questions later on, please feel to reach out. My contact information is there. And we'll hang out here for a couple of minutes if anyone else has any lingering questions. Thank you, everybody. Oh, Deirdre, could you perhaps bring up your final slide one more time? Someone's asking for your contact information, and I didn't include it on mine.
No, sure, that's great. Oh, one sec. It's my share my screen is not allowing me to share my.
Or we can drop it in the chat maybe.
Yeah, there we go. That's a great idea. So I'll give you guys my email and Twitter. And the Communication Matrix also has a Twitter, a Facebook, and their website. So if you want to stay in the know about what the offerings are, that might be a good way. And I think the Facebook might be the most active, kept up. So
that's good to know. Amanda, I see a question about CEUs. So we're going to be sending a